Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're looking for a conflict that just perfectly captures that massive shift from 20th century warfare to the terrifying new world of the nuclear age,
Yeah.
you really don't have to look any further than the Korean War.
It's a fascinating case. It's often defined not by what was won, but by what was held back, what was constrained.
That's the central paradox, isn't it?
It is. The Korean War was the first major, conventional conflict fought under the existential shadow of nuclear weapons. And this reality, it just forced the United States, a country that had just won a total absolute victory against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, to fundamentally rethink its entire strategic vocabulary.
So it wasn't just about tactics. They had to redefine victory itself.
Exactly. They had to move away from that all-or-nothing mindset of 1945. Commanders, politicians, everyone was scrambling.
And it's such a profound case study in strategic adaptation. I mean, it shows how quickly a huge operational success can flip and become a strategic disaster if you don't respect the new political limits.
That's our mission for this deep dive. We want to explore those deep struggles the United States faced trying to adapt its World War II mindset of total war to this new, frankly, baffling reality of limited war.
And we'll trace those shifts in strategy and doctrine as they happened, often reactively, under the command of Generals Douglas MacArthur, Matthew Ridgway, and then Mark Clark.
Right. And to guide us, we're drawing on some really key analyses. We'll be looking at Brian R. Gibby's work, Korean Showdown, and also Daniel Marston's book on limited war in the nuclear age.
We've also got Carter Malkasian's New Roots, Korea 1950-1951, which is fantastic on the operational shift to attrition.
It is. And finally, the really incredible historical context from H.W. Brands on the secret testimony around General MacArthur's relief. These sources, they help us get past the big personality clashes and really focus on the hard strategic facts that were driving decisions.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. June 1950, the war breaks out, and Marston calls this period the World War II hangover. What does that actually mean for the American military on the ground?
It means that pretty much every senior officer, every planner, and almost every piece of doctrine was built for one thing.
World War III.
World War III. Total mobilization, overwhelming force, and the unconditional surrender of the enemy. That was the blueprint that had just worked spectacularly. So in 1950, that was the institutional DNA. That was the only way they knew how to think about a major war.
So the problem wasn't a lack of firepower, it was a lack of conceptual flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
They were geared up for a heavyweight title fight, and they got something else entirely.
That's it, exactly. I mean, the military thinkers of the time, they saw decisive conflict as needing unlimited means to achieve unlimited ends. But Korea was this unique challenge because the other side, the communist bloc, now had the bomb.
Right.
So the idea of total war was suddenly just prohibitively costly. It could lead to mutual annihilation. And that casts this nuclear shadow over everything, where any big conventional war had to be, by definition, constrained.
And you can see how that mindset just crashes into reality. Academic critics like Gray have pointed out that the United States often struggles with this alignment of its political goals, the ends, with its military ways and means.
And Korea is the textbook example of that misalignment. I mean, when the U.S. first went in under the United Nations flag, the political goal was incredibly limited.
So push them back.
Just push the North Koreans back across the 30th parallel, restore the original border. It was a defensive policy, really. It was about upholding the UN Charter and, protecting Japan's recovery, which was vital. The geographic scope was locked down to just the Korean peninsula.
But then comes the Incheon landing.
Then comes Incheon. And military success just changes everything. Marston details how Operation Chromite was a tactical masterpiece. Just brilliant. It completely routed the North Korean army.
It essentially ended that first phase of the war.
It did. But that very success on the battlefield immediately triggers this massive mission creep back in Washington. Suddenly, the initial political goal of just repelling the invasion, it morphs.
Into something much bigger.
Much bigger. It becomes this ambitious, new military and political goal. The annihilation of the North Korean regime and the unification of the entire peninsula under the United Nations. The strategic goalposts just shifted completely.
Because the military, driven by that total victory mindset, saw an opening.
They saw a chance to win it all. And Washington, kind of blinded by that spectacular, easy success, gave the green light to push north.
And this brings us right to General MacArthur's just critical and ultimately catastrophic strategic failure.
The underestimation of the opponent.
The People's Republic of China.
Yes. The sources are so clear on this. MacArthur just dismisses verifiable concrete threats. He had solid intelligence well before the big Chinese intervention that the People's Republic of China had moved over 200,000 troops into Manchuria.
Not just that, but there were reports they were already crossing the Yalu River, weren't there?
Exactly. Reports that Chinese forces were already positioning themselves inside North Korea, and he just ignored it.
I mean, it's just wild to think that a commander who ran the entire Pacific theater in World War II would just wave off a threat of 200,000 troops on his flank. What was his thinking?
His rationale was really rooted in professional contempt and that old doctrine. Brands and Marston both point out his conviction that the PRC, having just finished its own bloody civil war, just didn't have the logistical capacity or the military sophistication to stand up to a modern, mechanized UN force.
And he was obsessed with air power.
Completely. He believed they had no real air force, which in his World War II math meant they were a non-issue. He was absolutely convinced that UN air power alone would just obliterate any organized Chinese advance before it even got started.
So that confidence is what led directly to his operational plan to push all the way to the Yalu River.
It's the only way that plan makes sense. His decision to split his forces, the 8th United States Army going up the West Coast, the X-Corps landing at Wonsan on the east, that was all based on the belief that the war was basically over, that the Chinese threat was a bluff.
He threw caution to the wind.
He had completely abandoned limited objectives. He was going for a total victory and annihilation strategy.
And the cost of that miscalculation, of failing to see that China would never allow a unified U.S.-backed Korea on its border, it was just total strategic disaster.
The Chinese intervention in late November 1950 near the Yalu, they used tactical surprise, overwhelming numbers, and it just completely invalidated every single one of MacArthur's assumptions. It led to this disastrous, panicked retreat by the United Nations Command, a military reversal of just profound magnitude.
Malkasian's analysis calls it perhaps the worst defeat in United States military history.
And it is. This single event, which was provoked entirely by MacArthur's overreach, it showed the reciprocal nature of war in the most brutal way possible. He escalated the means, and in return, he provoked an overwhelming response that just shattered his strategic ends.
Okay, let's really unpack this pivot point. It's so crucial. MacArthur's tactical genius at Incheon leads directly to strategic catastrophe. Because he failed to realize that success itself can be destabilizing.
He pushed the political objective way too far.
Which provoked China. And that changed the entire nature of the war overnight. Washington had no choice. They had to pivot, abandon unification, and just institute hard limits to survive.
And following that disaster, the Truman administration and the National Security Council, they hammered out a new policy. The core mandate from late 1950 became the bedrock of limited war theory from then on.
Which was what, specifically?
It was 4 things, really. First, avoid a general war with the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China at all costs. Second, localize the conflict. Keep it on the peninsula.
Don't let it spread.
Don't let it spread. And third, seek a negotiated settlement based on the status quo ante, or return to the 38th parallel.
So the goal of the fighting it fundamentally changes. It's not about annihilation anymore.
Not at all. It's purely about military coercion. The new goal is to make the war so unacceptably bloody and costly for the Chinese that they'll be forced to accept a stable border and come to the negotiating table.
And this is the moment General Matthew Ridgway comes in.
Right. He takes command of the 8th United States Army in December 1950, and he inherits an army that is just shattered. Morale is gone. They're in full retreat.
We get the new context immediately.
Instantly. He understood he was being asked to fight a limited war with an army that was only trained for total war. And he personally embraced those limited aims. He recognized that because of the nuclear threat, every war from now on would have to have constraints.
And Malkasian's work is just essential here. He talks about Ridgway's signature concept, which was attrition. But this wasn't the attrition we think of from World War I.
No, not the meat grinder. This was something different. It was attrition that was tailored specifically for the nuclear limited war age.
So what does that mean in practice?
Malkasian defines Ridgway's objective very clearly. It was maximizing enemy casualties while minimizing those of the United Nations Command and 8th United States Army. That second part, minimizing your own losses, that was the key strategic difference.
Because China had endless manpower.
Almost inexhaustible manpower. If the UN command got into a traditional slugging match where they were taking heavy casualties, the war would have become politically impossible to sustain back home. They had to find a way to bleed the enemy white without bleeding themselves dry.
So the solution was to use technology to inflict pain from a position of relative safety. What were the tactical pillars he built this on?
Ridgway developed three really specific, interconnected pillars that turned the whole situation around. The first one was what he called in-depth defensives and elasticity.
So planned withdrawals.
Planned withdrawals. He actively planned to give up ground to prevent the Chinese encirclement tactics that had worked so well before. This meant abandoning territory, even major cities like Seoul, and falling back to these pre-prepared, heavily fortified defensive lines like the Kansas and Wyoming lines.
That must have been a huge psychological shift for the troops. You know, being told to give up ground but that you're still winning.
A massive shift. It completely challenged the old doctrine that holding ground was everything. Ridgway redefined the objective. For him, terrain was only valuable if it helped you build a defense or kill more of the enemy. By giving up ground, he preserved his own forces and, more importantly, he stretched out the Chinese supply lines.
Making them a perfect target.
A perfect target for air and naval power. He turned the terrain into a tactical trap.
Okay, so that's the first pillar. The second is firepower superiority, which sounds obvious, but the way they used it was methodical and, frankly, terrifying.
It was. It was the massive, systematic use of artillery, mortars, and close air support. This firepower was the main way they destroyed communist forces without having to commit American infantry to costly frontal assaults. It was their technological answer to China's manpower.
The meat grinder effect.
That's what they called it. They were using 105 and 155 millimeter howitzers, almost like direct fire weapons, just shredding the communist formations that relied on these human wave attacks.
And the third pillar gave them their offensive punchback, but without the strategic risk. The limited objective attacks.
Right. Things like Operation Thunderbolt, Operation Killer, and Operation Ripper. These were designed from the start to be phased, methodical, and very conservative.
Their goal wasn't to take territory.
Not primarily. Their main goal was to destroy communist forces in a controlled, localized way. Ridgway specifically ordered his commanders to ensure that no single battalion or company was ever cut off or lost its cohesion. It was this constant balancing act between being aggressive and being absolutely paranoid about your own casualties.
Let's talk about one of those like Operation Killer. Malkasian says it was aimed at trapping enemy forces near Wonju.
Yeah, the idea behind Operation Killer was a classic military pincer movement. Create a pocket and then annihilate the communist forces caught inside. Now, in reality, they didn't take a lot of ground, and many of the Chinese forces who were incredibly disciplined and mobile, they managed to slip away.
But it was still considered a success.
A huge success, because the measure of success had changed. It was casualties inflicted, not ground gained. And they inflicted massive casualties.
And then there was Operation Ripper in March 51, which actually did retake Seoul. But Ridgway's reaction to that is really telling, isn't it?
It is. He was actually displeased with Operation Ripper, because even though it was successful in taking back ground with minimal UN casualties, he felt the cautious advance had allowed too many communist forces to retreat and reorganize.
So he's upset they took ground instead of killing more enemy soldiers.
Exactly. For Ridgway, the strategic value was purely coercive. He used his local superiority and firepower to soften up positions, and then he'd exploit an opportunity, but only if he was absolutely sure he could take the position without taking undue losses.
So what was the bottom line? What was the strategic outcome of this institutionalized, casualty-averse attrition?
MacArthur confirms that it worked. Ridgway's strategy achieved the limited political goal that Washington had set. By June of 1951, the constant, heavy, and disproportionate losses that the UN was inflicting on the Chinese and North Koreans, it compelled them to initiate ceasefire negotiations.
The communists just couldn't sustain those kinds of losses.
They couldn't. They suffered their greatest losses of the entire war during this period, especially in their big fifth phase offensive, where they just ran into a wall of UN artillery and air power. Peng Do-wai, the communist commander, admitted later that those losses forced them to give up on large-scale offensives for good.
So the genius of Ridgway, then, was that he recognized that this gradual, limited, almost indecisive kind of warfare, which would have looked like failure before 1945,
was precisely what made it so useful in the nuclear age.
It achieved just enough military coercion to get them to the negotiating table while keeping that critical risk of global escalation as low as possible.
Exactly right.
We've established that MacArthur failed because of this unlimited mindset, and Ridgway succeeded by embracing constraints. But the public debate at the time over MacArthur's firing was just It was furious.
Oh, it was a political firestorm.
And H.W. Brand's research on the declassified testimony from that time, it proves the military leadership was operating with hard, terrifying facts that they kept secret from the American public, and more importantly, from the enemy. So this raises the question, what were the vulnerabilities the U.S. was so afraid of exposing if they widened the war like MacArthur wanted?
This is where it gets really interesting. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's General Omar Bradley, General Hoyt Vandenberg of the Air Force, and General Joseph Collins from the Army, they publicly rejected MacArthur's call for a wider war.
Right. Bradley's famous line about it being the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy.
That was the public justification. But the detailed operational reasons for that quote, which only came out decades later when the testimony was declassified, they show just how profoundly vulnerable the United States was globally.
Let's start with the biggest threat lurking in the background. The Soviet Union. This wasn't just about China.
No, it was always about the Soviets. In his secret testimony, General Bradley laid out the immediate tangible threat posed by Soviet forces right there in the Far East. He confirmed the presence of 35 Russian divisions. That's around 500,000 troops.
Stationed where?
Strategically placed in key areas like Vladivostok, Port Arthur Darren, Sakhalin Island. And he also specified that the Soviets had a huge naval presence, including about 85 submarines operating in the waters right around Korea.
So if MacArthur's plan had provoked the Soviets into intervening, what would have been the immediate consequence for the UN forces on the peninsula?
Bradley was blunt. An intervention on that scale with that kind of Soviet naval and air power would make resupplying the troops in Korea almost impossible. And evacuating them, he called it a very serious situation. He was essentially admitting that they could be trapped and destroyed.
It wasn't just losing Korea, it was losing the entire army there.
It was. And Bradley also gave the global picture that MacArthur was ignoring. If the war in Asia escalated, the Soviets could use the Chinese as a proxy or even act directly to seize strategic points all across Southeast Asia, Indochina, Siam, Burma. Escalating in Korea meant risking the rest of Asia and at the same time pulling resources away from the defense of Europe.
Which was the main priority.
Always the main priority. So MacArthur is looking at the tactical map of Korea, while the Joint Chiefs are staring at the global strategic map and seeing potential disaster everywhere.
The testimony also just shatters this myth of, bottomless American military power, especially air power, which MacArthur thought was his ace in the hole.
General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Air Force Chief of Staff, delivered the brutal truth. He said the United States Air Force was a shoestring Air Force. The war in Korea, even though it was limited, was eating up a massive percentage of their available tactical air strength.
How much?
Roughly 80 to 85% of the entire United States Air Force's tactical capacity was tied up in Korea.
Wow. So MacArthur's plan to start bombing runs deep into China would have been
strategically draining and operationally useless. Vandenberg stressed that escalating the bombing would be reckless. He called it a drop in the bucket against the sheer size of China. And more importantly, it would completely empty the strategic air reserves they needed to defend Europe from a potential Soviet attack.
So they were making a very clear choice to prioritize the primary theater, Europe, over the secondary one in Asia. The public just couldn't know how thin they were stretched.
No way.
Which brings us to this sanctuary paradox that MacArthur complained about constantly. The rule against bombing targets north of the Yalu River, which he claimed gave the Chinese an unfair advantage.
Right, a safe haven for them to build up forces.
But in their secret testimony, Secretary of Defense George Marshall and the Joint Chiefs argued the complete opposite.
They did. They fundamentally understood that those constraints were a strategic shield, and that the shield benefited the UN command way more than it benefited the Chinese. General Bradley flatly contradicted MacArthur, saying the Chinese were not fighting all out. He pointed out they had yet to use their own air power against critical UN assets.
Like what? What were they not hitting?
They weren't hitting the supply lines, they weren't hitting the front lines from the air, they weren't hitting the vital port of Busan where everything came in, and they weren't hitting the American bases in Japan.
And why were the UN forces so much more vulnerable to that kind of reciprocal escalation than the Chinese were?
Because the UN was an expeditionary force. It was completely dependent on its sea lanes and its fixed air bases. Vandenberg pointed out that the main supply base was Japan, which was highly vulnerable, and the UN airfields in Korea. The planes were often parked wingtip to wingtip, just sitting ducks.
Perfect targets.
Perfect targets. If the war had expanded, Those static, high-value assets would have been ideal for Chinese or Soviet air attacks.
General Joe Collins, the Army chief, he used a really specific example to drive this point home, didn't he? The Hungnam evacuation.
He did. He pointed out that when MacArthur was first demanding to bomb across the Yalu, U.S. forces were critically exposed, especially the X-Corps, which was being evacuated by sea from the port of Hungnam. He said he was dreadfully afraid that if they'd allowed bombing north of the Yalu, it might have triggered Russian air power.
And they would have been sitting ducks in the harbor.
Exactly. Bombardment from the air, submarine attacks on the evacuation ships. I mean, imagine thousands of troops packed onto commercial ships. They are terrifyingly vulnerable. Collins's message was clear. MacArthur should have been profoundly grateful for the limits on the war because those limits were the only thing that guaranteed his forces survived.
So the big synthesis here is that the leadership in Washington understood that the limits weren't political weakness. They were a calculated, critical shield protecting American global interests.
Absolutely. Escalating against China would have invited massive retaliation against the UN's most vulnerable points, and it would have virtually guaranteed not only an American defeat in Korea, but a loss of global strategic superiority.
So by the time the negotiations finally open in '51, Ridgway's attrition strategy has worked. It got the communists to the table. But then the negotiations just drag on and on and on into 1952.
And the war settles into this brutal strategic stalemate along those defensive lines, the Kansas and Wyoming lines. And Gibby's work shows this became a grinding, incredibly high-cost conflict. By late 1952, American forces were still taking 1,000 casualties a week.
1,000 a week.
The heaviest casualty rate for that entire year. And it was all happening without any significant strategic or tactical gains, just bleeding for inches of ground.
And this constant costly attrition, which was being fought basically for leverage at the Panmunjom negotiating table, it started to seriously degrade the Eighth Army's effectiveness, didn't it? What kind of problems was Gibby finding in the command structure?
The stalemate led directly to this culture of massive risk avoidance and a real decline in fighting proficiency. Gibby talks about a critical manpower crisis, where the rotation policy meant experienced commanders were constantly being shipped home.
And they were being replaced by junior officers who didn't have the combat experience for those roles.
Right. It became normal for a major to be commanding a battalion, which should have been a lieutenant colonel's job, or a lieutenant leading a company instead of an experienced captain. And these younger, less experienced officers, they're under this immense pressure from above to keep casualties down.
So they get timid.
They get very timid. They became more afraid of making a mistake that would lead to high losses than they were motivated to take aggressive action. They just started avoiding contact with the enemy.
And that risk avoidance, it leads to a collapse in complex military skills, like combined arms tactics.
Absolutely. Gibby pulls from these after-action reports, especially from operations like Operation Showdown in late '52, which was about seizing these tactical hills. And the reports showed that the soldiers just weren't prepared to move aggressively under fire. They couldn't coordinate effectively. They neglected basic security.
So the Army was just losing its fighting edge.
It was losing its aggressive spirit, which meant that any plan to use a big offensive to force a deal at the negotiating table was probably doomed because the instrument to execute that plan was going dull.
And this was made even worse by micromanagement from higher up. A classic problem in a limited war where every casualty is a political headline.
That's a crucial point. Eighth Army leaders, getting hammered from Washington to reduce casualties but still inflict them, they responded by imposing this extreme oversight. They prohibited any offensive action by a company-sized unit or larger without getting explicit approval from way up the chain.
Which just kills initiative.
It kills it dead. Gibby says it created a varying degree of hesitancy on the part of commanders to take aggressive action. The leadership was trading command initiative for casualty control, and in the process, they were bleeding the Army of its fighting spirit.
So into this mess comes General Mark Clark, who takes command in May 1952. He looks at the stalemate, the institutional decay, and he decides the UN just hasn't been putting on enough military pressure.
Right, and his answer was the incredibly ambitious and very high-risk O-Plan 852.
This was his plan for a decisive military victory.
It was a complete break from Ridgway's limited attrition. Clark was swinging for the fences, trying to achieve total military coercion, which looked a lot like annihilation again. It was this massive three-phase operation to seize the narrow waist of the peninsula, the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, and then launch a grand encirclement, maybe even push all the way back to the Yalu.
I mean, considering what happened to MacArthur, the scope of that plan is just staggering. What kind of resources did Clark say he needed to make it work?
The numbers were astronomical. He called for more U.S. and UN divisions, more Republic of Korea divisions, and critically, he wanted to bring in 2 Chinese nationalist divisions from Taiwan.
Which would have been a massive political escalation.
A huge one. And on top of that, he needed more ships. A battleship, 6 cruisers, 2 carriers, 41 destroyers, plus over 200 more bombers and fighters. He was basically mobilizing for another major war.
And then there was the nuclear option, which Marston and Gibby talk about. It was on the table.
It was. O-Plan 852 explicitly allowed for the serious consideration of using up to 600 atomic weapons against targets in Manchuria and North Korea if the conventional plan stalled or if the Chinese counterattacked in force.
So he was basically proposing to throw out the entire limited war framework.
Completely. He was ready to discard 3 of Washington's 4 core strategic rules. Don't violate the Manchurian border, don't use nationalist Chinese forces, and don't impose a general blockade on China.
But Gibby points out that the whole plan was just fundamentally flawed.
Deeply flawed. It was based on this really questionable assumption that if the communists were faced with this overwhelming conventional force, they would just meekly accept armistice terms. But that contradicted everything they knew about how the communists negotiated. They only made concessions when they were under heavy sustained pressure and they felt politically vulnerable, not just because you showed up with a bigger army.
And his own intelligence reports undermined the plan, didn't they?
Completely. Clark's own intelligence staff recognized that the Chinese could mobilize up to 27 additional divisions from mainland China within 90 days. And that force alone would have completely overwhelmed the new troops Clark was asking for. The plan was risking a repeat of the Yalu disaster, only this time it would be even worse because U.S. strategic reserves were already committed.
So the Joint Chiefs were not exactly thrilled.
Not at all. But even though Clark's plan was rejected, the underlying frustration with the stalemate was very real, especially with the incoming Eisenhower administration. President-elect Eisenhower saw the plan as way too resource-intensive and escalatory, but he was willing to raise the stakes himself.
By threatening to use nuclear weapons if the talks stayed stalled.
That threat was critical. But he was also offered another, less escalatory alternative that still allowed him to maintain military pressure. And that came from General Paik Sunyup,
The Republic of Korea Army Chief of Staff. He had a different idea.
a much more politically and financially smart idea. His proposal was simple. Massively expand the Republic of Korea Army from 12 to 20 divisions.
Let the Koreans do more of the fighting.
Let the Koreans fight the Chinese. It offered Eisenhower a cheaper, politically safer way to keep up the military pressure. The strategic math was pretty stark. Instead of risking the huge American casualties and political fallout of O-Plan 852, or the global risk of using nuclear weapons, they could leverage South Korean manpower. It was a strategy focused on exchanging dead Americans for sterile ground.
And in the end, after all that, the armistice that was finally signed in July 1953, the terms were almost identical to what was on the table 15 months earlier.
Nearly identical.
So what does that massive delay and the immense human cost of those 15 months tell us about the core strategic failure of the war?
Admiral Joy, who was one of the senior UN delegates at the talks, he gave the clearest answer. He said the delay wasn't just because the communists were being stubborn. It was because the United States had failed from the very beginning to clarify its own political objectives and then stick to them.
He said the political goals were allowed to weather vane with the winds of combat.
Exactly. They accommodated themselves to whatever was happening on the battlefield instead of being the fixed goal that the military operations were supposed to achieve.
So the classic Clausewitzian idea that war is just an extension of policy, it got flipped on its head. Policy became an extension of the battlefield.
It did, and that's what led to the chaotic push north and then the long, bloody, protracted stalemate. It was a failure of political strategic clarity from day one. The war was defined by the reactive nature of American strategy, and it took them 2 years of high-cost fighting to solve a problem that really required a fixed, disciplined political settlement all along.
This deep dive into Korea, it really provides this profound, multi-layered lesson in the relationship between strategy, doctrine, and the harsh realities of geopolitics in the nuclear age. It really shows that sometimes success isn't defined by how much you take, but by how much you're willing to give up to keep things stable.
It does.
What are the key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with from all this?
I think the first one has to be reciprocity in war. The sources just show us over and over that the character of a war is never static. It can start as one thing, a limited police action to repel an invasion, but the enemy gets a vote. Their reaction, like the Chinese intervention, can instantly transform it into a war of annihilation or a long war of attrition.
So strategic thinking always has to anticipate the enemy's most damaging countermove.
It has to. And it has to recognize that sometimes the limitations you place on yourself are the very things that prevent that countermove from ever happening.
And the second takeaway really gets at the foundational failure of MacArthur and the necessary wisdom of the Joint Chiefs.
That's the principle that strategy must serve policy. The Korean War demonstrated, maybe more clearly than any other conflict, that military strategy has to be constantly and rigorously subordinated to political objectives, especially when the cost of escalation is catastrophic.
The constraints weren't weakness.
They weren't weakness, as MacArthur saw them. They were calculated strategic shields that protected American global interests and, very likely prevented World War III. We learned the hard way that you have to clarify and fix your political goals before you get to the end game.
The Korean War was a bloody strategic laboratory. It forced the United States to shift from a mindset of total victory to one of limited coercion, and it fundamentally changed how we think about conflict. It taught us that military power in the nuclear age has to be used like a scalpel, not a hammer.
And that strategic wisdom sometimes lies in restraint, not just in aggression.
Absolutely. So what does the Korean experience, where ultimate strategic success was found not in total victory, but in accepting maximum constraints to avoid a global war, what does that tell you about the adaptability that's required of modern military leaders when they're preparing for large-scale combat in a contested environment where, once again, the risk of escalation is the primary limiting factor?
It's the central question.
Think about that adaptability, and we will see you on the next Deep Dive.